The Battle of Gettysburg was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The air was thick with the sound of cannon fire and the cries of men. But we fought on, believing our cause was righteous. My regiment, like so many others, stood firm on that blood-soaked ground, determined to see it through. I can still hear the shouts of my comrades, the sharp commands of officers, the blast of rifles that seemed to split the sky. War had been hell long before the creatures came, but in those early moments, we still believed it was a hell we could survive. Elias was beside me, a young man from Philadelphia, not yet 20. I remember his hands trembling as he reloaded his rifle. "We'll get through this," I told him, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. He nodded, his eyes wide, but full of hope, clinging to the idea that he would return home. Home. That word meant something different to each of us. For Elias, it was his family in Philadelphia, his mother and his sister Anna. For me, home had become a distant memory, lost with Margaret and our child. Even now, I can barely recall their faces without feeling that sharp stab of guilt. The day was clear when it began, or at least as clear as any day could be on a battlefield. The sky above us was blue, and the sun, though dimmed by the smoke of artillery, still cast a pale light over the carnage. But then, something changed. The sound of the battle seemed to muffle, as though the world had taken a breath and was holding it. I glanced up, confused. The sun, what little of it we could see, was gone, blotted out by a thick, unnatural darkness that spread across the sky like ink spilling into water. The noise around us faded into a haunting silence, save for the pounding of my heart. Then came the flames. They fell from the sky, blue as ice and cold to the touch, though they burned everything they touched. At first, we thought it was some new Confederate weapon, a trick to turn the tide of the battle. But when the flames struck the ground, something far worse emerged. From the very earth itself, these things, creatures, demons, I don't know what to call them, began to claw their way out. Their shapes were grotesque, twisted mockeries of men, with flesh peeled back from their bones and faces contorted into expressions of agony. Some were massive, towering over us like giants from some long-forgotten nightmare. Others were small, almost childlike, but no less deadly. I saw one of them fall upon a group of Confederate soldiers just across the field. For a moment, we forgot the war, forgot that we were enemies. All I could think was to survive. The creature ripped through them with ease, tossing their bodies aside, as if they were nothing more than broken toys. Then it turned its gaze toward us. I don't remember giving the order to retreat, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, Elias and I were running, fleeing into the forest beyond the battlefield. The sounds of battle were drowned out by the shrieks of those demons, their inhuman cries echoing through the trees. I could hear Elias panting beside me, struggling to keep up. My own legs felt like lead, but fear drove us onward. There was no shame in running. Not from those things. I'd seen enough men die that day to know we wouldn't stand a chance if we stopped. The forest was dark, the trees close and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. It should have felt like safety, a place to catch our breath, but I could still hear them, those creatures, somewhere in the distance. Their shrieks cut through the air like blades, and I knew they were hunting us. We didn't stop, not for a long while. We couldn't afford to. Every second felt like it could be our last. Every shadow seemed to hold another horror. Eventually, we came to a small clearing, and only then did we allow ourselves a moment's rest. I collapsed against a tree, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. Elias did the same, his face pale and streaked with sweat. He looked at me, his eyes wide with terror. What were those things?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer for him. "I don't know," I said, shaking my head. "But whatever they are, they're not of this world." I could hear the fear in my own voice, something I hadn't let slip through during all the battles I'd fought. But this was different. War was something a man could understand, something he could fight, even if it killed him. But those creatures, there was no understanding them, no fighting them. Night fell quickly in the forest, and with it came a deeper sense of dread. The creatures were still out there, I knew, prowling the battlefield, hunting anyone foolish enough to still be alive. The sounds of their footsteps, heavy, lumbering, haunted the edges of my hearing. We had escaped the worst of it, for now, but there was no telling how long that would last. I had seen men break in battle before, but this was different. This was a terror that reached beyond the battlefield, beyond war itself. I didn't sleep that night. Neither did Elias. We stayed there in that clearing, rifles in hand, eyes wide open, waiting for the dawn. But even as I sat there, listening to the wind rustle through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was still coming, that this was only the beginning of our horror. The morning came slowly, the sun never quite breaking through the heavy clouds. Even in the daylight, the forest felt as though it were cloaked in shadow, the trees pressing in on us from all sides. Elias and I didn't speak much as we made our way through the underbrush, our eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of those creatures. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. After what we had seen, nothing felt safe anymore. War had become a backdrop to something far darker. We had no plan, no real destination beyond moving further from that cursed battlefield. The creatures had torn apart everything in their path, and we could only hope that somehow, somewhere, we might find a place untouched by their wrath. I remember thinking about Margaret during those quiet hours, wondering what she would say if she saw me now, if she could see the kind of world I was trapped in. The thought of her, of our child, was both a comfort and a torment. Sometimes I could almost hear her voice in the wind, calling me home. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, we stumbled upon a small farmhouse nestled at the edge of the forest. At first, it looked abandoned, its wooden walls weathered and the windows dark, but there was smoke rising from the chimney, a thin, hopeful plume that promised warmth, and maybe, just maybe, safety. Elias looked at me, his face pale and exhausted. "Do you think anyone's still there?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I reckon we'll find out soon enough," I replied, though my hand tightened around my rifle. Nothing about this world felt right anymore, and trust was a luxury we could no longer afford. Still, we had to take the chance. We were running on empty, and the idea of shelter, even for a short time, was too tempting to ignore. As we approached, a gruff voice called out from inside the house. "Who's out there?" A man stepped onto the porch, shotgun in hand. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with a face lined by years of hard living. His eyes were sharp, but there was a wariness in them, like he had seen too much already. "We don't mean no harm," I said, raising my hands to show we weren't a threat. "We're Union soldiers, just looking for a place to rest." He sized us up for a moment before lowering his shotgun slightly. "Name's John," he said, not quite friendly but not hostile either. "Ain't much left around here, but you can stay for a bit if you keep quiet. Them things, they don't take kindly to noise." John led us inside, where the warmth of the fire greeted us, though the small home felt hollow, like it had once held more life than it did now. I could see the fear in John's eyes, the same fear I had seen in every man since the flames fell. He offered us some water and bread, simple, but more than we'd had in days. As we sat around the fire, he told us about what had happened in the days since the creatures arrived. "They ain't human, that's for sure," John said, staring into the flames as though they held the answers. "Seen 'em ripped through men like paper. I don't know what brought them, but it's like the gates of hell opened up and spit them out." His words hung heavy in the air. Elias sat quietly, his hands shaking, as he held the cup of water John had given him. I could see the fear in him too, but more than that, I saw something else. Determination. He wasn't ready to give up, not while his family might still be out there. After John finished speaking, Elias cleared his throat. "I need to find my sister," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She's in Philadelphia. I have to know if she's still alive." John shook his head. "Ain't nothing left in those cities. From what I've heard, it's worse there than it is out here. You'll be walking into death." But Elias didn't waver. He just looked down at his hands, quiet but resolute. I knew then that nothing John said was going to stop him. And deep down, I knew I couldn't let him go alone. That night, I didn't sleep again. Instead, I sat by the fire, staring into the flickering light, my thoughts a jumble of memories and fear. Margaret came to me again in my dreams, her face soft and familiar, but there was a sadness in her eyes. She reached out for me, her voice gentle, calling me to rest, to join her. "Come home," she whispered. "You've done enough." It was so tempting, the idea of letting go, of leaving this nightmare behind. But every time I thought of giving in, I saw Elias's face, the determination in his eyes as he spoke of his sister. I couldn't abandon him. Not yet. By morning, Elias was ready to leave. John tried to convince us to stay, to wait out the worst of it, but we both knew there was no waiting out what had come. We packed what little we had and said our goodbyes. John gave us a small bag of food, and a look that said he didn't expect to see us again. "Good luck," he muttered, as he stood on the porch, watching us disappear into the forest. The journey ahead felt impossible, but we pressed on, driven by the faint hope that someone, still survived out there. As we moved further from John's homestead, the sounds of the forest closed in around us, unnatural, ominous. The creatures were still out there, lurking in the shadows, hunting, waiting. Every step forward felt like a step deeper into some nightmare we couldn't wake from. But there was no turning back. Not now. We walked in silence for hours, the weight of what lay ahead hanging over us. Elias never spoke of his fear, but I could see it in the way he gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. I felt it too, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The memory of Margaret still lingered, her voice soft and comforting, pulling at me from some distant place. But I couldn't go to her, not yet. Ahead of us, the road stretched on, dark and foreboding. Whatever horrors lay in Philadelphia, we would face them together. There was no other choice. We reached the outskirts of Philadelphia just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, or at least what should have been the sun. The sky was still thick with those unnatural clouds, so dark and heavy that it seemed like night had come early. But the light, the sickly orange-red glow, wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from the city itself. Philadelphia was burning. Flames leaped high into the air, casting long shadows across the charred landscape, and the smell of smoke and something else, something foul and inhuman, filled the air. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat at the sight of it. I had seen cities burn before, back in the early days of the war, but this was different. There was no sense of battle here, no strategy or reason. This was pure destruction, chaos given form. Elias stood beside me, his eyes wide with horror. His hands trembled on the barrel of his rifle, but he didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face said it all. This was his home, and it was gone. "We've got to keep moving," I said quietly, though my voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. Elias nodded, his jaw set in a hard line. He was still determined, still holding onto that last thread of hope that somehow, somewhere in that burning city, his sister was alive. I didn't have the heart to tell him what I already knew deep down, that there was no way anyone had survived this. But we kept moving, because what else could we do? As we made our way closer, the streets became a maze of rubble and ash. Buildings had crumbled under the weight of the flames, their blackened remains still smoldering. Every now and then, we would hear the distant sound of something moving in the shadows, a rustling, a low growl, but nothing showed itself. Not yet. Anyway, I kept my rifle close, my eyes scanning every alley and doorway for signs of movement. I wasn't sure if it was the demons or something else, but I knew we weren't alone in this city. We came across the remains of a marketplace, The stalls toppled over and the goods scattered across the cobblestones, charred beyond recognition. Bodies lay in the street, some burned, others torn apart. I felt bile rise in my throat at the sight of them. Men, women, children, none of them had been spared. The demons didn't discriminate. They didn't care about the war or which side you fought for. They only cared about destruction. Elias knelt beside one of the bodies, a young woman whose face had been burned beyond recognition. I could see the flicker of hope in his eyes as he checked for signs of life, but it was quickly extinguished when he realized she wasn't Anna. He didn't cry, though. He hadn't cried since the day those blue flames fell from the sky. He just stood up and kept walking, his shoulders squared, and his gaze fixed straight ahead. The deeper we went into the city, the worse it got. The fires raged higher, and the air grew thick with ash and smoke. It was hard to breathe, and my throat burned with every step. But we couldn't stop. Not now. Elias moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the ruins of every building we passed, his steps quick and sure. I followed behind him, though my mind was elsewhere, wandering between the present and the memories that haunted me. Every so often, I would see a flash of Margaret in the corner of my vision, her face pale and sad, her voice whispering my name. "Come home," she would say, her voice soft as the wind. I tried to shake her from my mind, but she lingered, a ghost I couldn't escape. As we neared Elias's old neighborhood, the destruction became even more personal. He pointed out buildings where he had once played as a child, now reduced to rubble. He showed me the remnants of the church where his family had worshipped, the steeple collapsed in a heap of stones and wood. And then we reached it, his home, or what was left of it. The house stood at the end of a narrow street, its roof caved in, and the front door hanging off its hinges. The windows were blackened with soot, and the walls were cracked and crumbling. It was a miracle it hadn't collapsed entirely. Elias rushed forward, his heart clearly racing with both fear and hope. I followed, my rifle ready, though I knew there was little I could do against what might be waiting inside. Elias pushed the door open, and the two of us stepped into the darkened house. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, and the floorboards creaked beneath our boots. "Anna," Elias called out, his voice hoarse and trembling. "Anna, are you here?" There was no answer, only silence. We searched the house, moving from room to room, but there was no sign of life, no sign of Anna. Elias's face grew paler with every passing second, the hope draining from him as we combed through the wreckage. When we reached the last room, the kitchen, he stopped. His eyes went wide, and for a moment I thought he had found her. But then I saw what he was staring at. In the corner of the room, a body lay crumpled against the wall, covered in ash and debris. It was an older woman, her face drawn and pale, her hands clutching a small crucifix to her chest. Elias fell to his knees beside her, his breath catching in his throat. "Mother," he whispered, his voice breaking. "No." I stood back, giving him a moment, though there were no words I could offer that would make it better. Elias stayed there for a long time, kneeling beside his mother's body, his head bowed in grief. I felt the weight of it too, the loss, the hopelessness of it all. But I knew we couldn't stay. The city was still burning, and those creatures were still out there, waiting, hunting. After what felt like hours, Elias finally stood. His face was hard, his eyes cold and empty. "She's not here," he said quietly. "Anna's not here." I nodded, though I didn't know what to say. The truth was, I didn't think we'd find her. But Elias wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. We left the house in silence, the flames still flickering in the distance, and set out again, though I didn't know where we would go from here. Leaving Elias's home behind felt like walking away from a grave. His mother was gone, and we hadn't found Anna, but he was determined to press on. I could see it in his eyes. There was no turning back now. Grief had hardened him, but it had also given him a dangerous resolve. We trudged through the smoldering streets, navigating the crumbling ruins of what had once been a city full of life. The fires still raged in the distance, casting an orange glow over the horizon, and every shadow seemed to hold a new horror. The demons, though unseen, were never far. The deeper we went, the more I could feel them, those creatures that had poured out of the blue flames. Their presence was like a weight in the air, thick and oppressive. Every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, or hear the distant growl of something inhuman. Elias pushed forward, his rifle clutched tightly in his hands, but I knew we couldn't outrun them forever. We were being hunted, and it was only a matter of time before they caught up. The streets grew narrower as we made our way through the ruins, the buildings on either side towering over us like broken teeth. The air was thick with smoke and ash, and the heat from the fires made it hard to breathe. Every step forward felt like a step closer to death. But we had no choice. We had to keep moving. It was just after dusk when the first one appeared. We had taken refuge in the remains of an old church, its stained glass windows shattered and its pews blackened by fire. I was standing near the doorway, keeping watch, when I saw it. A massive, hulking figure moving through the smoke. It was unlike any of the demons I had seen before, its body twisted and grotesque, its skin flayed and dripping with blood. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace, like it knew we were watching. I didn't have time to warn Elias before it lunged. The creature crashed through the remains of the doorway, its claws outstretched, and I barely had time to raise my rifle. The shot rang out, but it did little to stop the beast. It barreled into me, sending me crashing to the ground. Pain shot through my body as I hit the cold stone floor, but I forced myself to roll away, narrowly avoiding the creature's massive claws as they raked the ground where I had just been. "James!" Elias shouted, raising his rifle and firing off a shot. The bullet hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely slowed. It let out a roar, a guttural, inhuman sound that echoed through the ruined church, and charged at Elias. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my saber, and lunged at the beast from behind, driving the blade into its side. The creature howled in pain, thrashing wildly as it tried to shake me off. Elias fired again, and this time the bullet found its mark, right between the creature's glowing eyes. It collapsed to the ground with a heavy thud, its body twitching as the life drained out of it. I stood there for a moment, panting, my hands slick with blood, both mine and the beast's. Elias was by my side in an instant, his face pale but determined. "There'll be more," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We can't stay here." He was right. The sound of the gunshots would bring the others, and we were in no condition to fight off another attack. We gathered our things quickly and slipped out of the church, moving through the shadows as the night deepened. The streets were eerily quiet now, the fires in the distance still burning, but there was no sign of the demons. Yet, as we made our way through the city, I could feel the weight of my own exhaustion pulling at me. Every step was harder than the last, and the pain in my side from where the creature had struck me throbbed with every breath. But I couldn't stop. Not while Elias was still moving, still searching for Anna. He hadn't said much since we left his home, but I knew he was clinging to that last thread of hope. I only wished I could do the same. We didn't get far before the next attack came. We were crossing a narrow alleyway when I heard it, the low, guttural growl of something waiting in the darkness. I barely had time to react before another creature lunged at us, its body slithering across the ground like a snake, its face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a man's. Elias fired off a shot, but the creature was fast, too fast. It knocked the rifle from his hands, sending him sprawling to the ground. I rushed forward, my saber drawn, but the creature was quicker. It lashed out with one of its claws, striking me across the chest and knocking me back. I hit the ground hard, gasping for breath, as the pain shot through me. The creature turned its attention back to Elias, its jaws opening wide, as it prepared to strike. And then something strange happened. Just as the creature was about to lunge at Elias, a bright light appeared in the sky. A single glowing star shining through the thick clouds of smoke. The creature hesitated for a moment, its eyes flicking upward, and in that brief moment of distraction, Elias scrambled to his feet and grabbed his rifle. He fired once, and the creature collapsed in a heap, its body twitching as the life drained out of it. We didn't stop to question what had happened. We didn't have time. The demons were closing in, and we had to keep moving. I could feel the blood seeping through my shirt, my chest burning with every breath, but I forced myself to keep going. We slipped through the alleyways and narrow streets, the glowing star overhead our only guide, as we made our way toward the outskirts of the city. By the time we reached the edge of Philadelphia, I could barely stand. My vision was starting to blur, and every step felt like it could be my last. But I couldn't stop. Not yet. Elias was still moving, still determined, and I couldn't leave him to face this nightmare alone. We found a small clearing on the edge of the city, just beyond the ruins, and collapsed there, the stars still shining overhead. I knew then that my time was running out. The wounds I had taken were too much, and I could feel the cold creeping in. But as I lay there, staring up at that single bright star, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. Margaret was there, standing just beyond the light, her face soft and kind. She reached out to me, her voice gentle as she whispered, "It's time to come home." I closed my eyes, letting the darkness take me. When I opened my eyes again, everything felt distant, like I was floating somewhere between the world of the living and whatever waited on the other side. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, the faint crackle of fire in the distance, and Elias's voice, though it sounded far away, like an echo from a dream. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, weighed down by the pain that had settled deep in my bones. I knew somewhere in the back of my mind that I wasn't going to last much longer. The wounds I'd taken in that last fight were too deep. But I couldn't leave yet, not until I was sure Elias would be safe. Elias was kneeling beside me, his face pale and drawn, but there was a new light in his eyes, a kind of desperate determination that I hadn't seen before. "You're going to be all right," he said, though we both knew it wasn't true. His hands were stained with my blood as he tried to press down on the worst of the wounds, but it was no use. The cold was already creeping in, slow and steady, and I knew it wouldn't be long now. "Elias," I rasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to me. You've got to keep going. You've got to find Anna." He shook his head, his jaw tight. "I can't leave you here," he said, his voice breaking. "Not like this." But there was nothing he could do for me now. We both knew it. The only thing that mattered was making sure he survived, making sure he got out of this nightmare alive. The star was still shining overhead, its light cutting through the smoke and darkness that surrounded us. It was strange, seeing something so bright and pure in a world that had been consumed by fire and death. I wanted to believe that it was Margaret's doing, that somehow she was watching over me, guiding us through this last stretch. Maybe it was just the fever setting in. But as I lay there, staring up at that star, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Elias was still talking, but his words had become a blur, lost in the haze that was slowly overtaking my mind. My thoughts drifted, slipping between memories of the past and the strange, dreamlike present. I saw Margaret again, standing at the edge of a field, her hand outstretched, waiting for me. She was smiling, the way she used to, and behind her I could see the soft, golden light of the sun setting over the hills. It was peaceful, the kind of peace I hadn't known in years. But I couldn't go to her, not yet. Not while Elias was still kneeling beside me, still holding on to that faint thread of hope that I might survive. I had to do something to help him, to give him the strength to keep going. With a great effort, I reached out and grabbed his arm, pulling him close. "Elias," I said, my voice steadier than I thought it could be, "you have to leave. Now. They're coming. You can't wait for me." He shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes, but I tightened my grip on his arm. "Go," I said again, more forcefully this time. "Anna needs you. You have to find her. You're the only one who can." I could see the conflict in his eyes, the pain of leaving me behind, but slowly he nodded. "I'll come back for you," he whispered, though we both knew that wasn't true. Elias stood, grabbing his rifle and slinging it over his shoulder. He cast one last glance down at me, his face a mixture of grief and determination, before turning and disappearing into the trees. I watched him go, my heart heavy, but also at peace. He would survive. I was sure of that now. The cold settled in quickly after that. I could feel it spreading through my limbs, numbing the pain that had been burning through me for so long. I closed my eyes, letting the world fade away, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, I felt her presence again, Margaret. She was closer now, her hand reaching out to me, her voice soft and kind. "It's time to come home," she whispered, and this time, I knew I was ready. I let go. I don't know how long I was gone, if time even mattered in the place between life and death. But when I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the clearing anymore. I was standing in a field, the grass soft beneath my feet, and the sky above me was a brilliant, endless blue. The air was warm, filled with the scent of wildflowers and the gentle hum of bees. It felt like home. Margaret was there, standing just a few paces away, her dark hair blowing in the breeze. She smiled at me, the way she used to, and in that moment, all the pain, all the loss, melted away. I walked toward her, my heart light for the first time in what felt like years. She took my hand, and together, we stood there, watching the sun set over the hills, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. It was over. Far away, in the ruins of Philadelphia, Elias kept moving. He didn't look back. The stars still shone overhead, guiding him through the darkness, and though the road ahead was long and uncertain, he knew he wasn't alone. Somewhere, in the deepest part of his heart, he felt it, my presence, watching over him, guiding him toward whatever future lay ahead. Anna was out there. I didn't know if she was alive, but I knew Elias would find her. He had to. And whatever demons still lurked in the shadows, whatever horrors waited in the dark, he would face them. For now, though, there was hope. A glimmer of light in the darkness. A faint reminder that even in the worst of times, we can still find our way home.